Welcome, everybody.
Welcome. Thank you, Abby. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Sandra Hernández, and I'm the President and CEO of the California Healthcare Foundation. We're an independent nonprofit philanthropy who's really dedicated to improving the health and healthcare of all Californians. We're a very empiric-oriented foundation. We've done a tremendous amount of work in the area of workforce and health workforce. And we all know people who are directly or indirectly impacted by new federal policies with regard to deportations, mass deportation targets for immigrants living in our state. And when these policies first came about, it seemed clear that there was an incredible opportunity to gather evidence and data to understand what the impact might be of massive deportations of immigrants in the state of California. And as with any time I think of the business community, the Bay Area Council, Jim Wonderman and his team always come top of mind to me. I reached out to Jim, recognizing that he has relationships with so many of you, to suggest that this would be an opportunity to take a look at other industries outside of healthcare and to be able to understand what the evidence would point to and perhaps lead us to think about what meaningful immigration reform might come out of this kind of evidence. An absolute pleasure to work with Abby, a top-notch economic researcher at the Bay Area Council, Maria-Elena Young, top-notch researcher at UC Merced, who's done a tremendous amount of work on immigration and working with immigrant communities. On behalf of the foundation, we're just honored to be able to be party to this and to support it. I'm very much looking forward to the panelists that we'll hear from shortly. So thank you to the Bay Area Council, to you, Maria-Elena Young, and those of you who are joining us. So with that, Abby, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and welcome, everybody. My name is Abby Raisz. I'm the Vice President of Research at the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, and we're one of the region's leading economic and policy think tanks, and I'm one of the co-authors of the report we'll be discussing today, the economic impact of mass deportation in California, which is really a first of its kind study at the economic costs of mass deportation in the state, combining original economic modeling with interviews across industries and communities statewide. So we're really excited to have you with us for this timely and important conversation about sort of the workforce implications of what increased immigration enforcement would really mean in our state. So we'll be giving a short presentation of findings from the report, but we highly encourage you to check out the full report if you're interested in the data shown here, which I'll link to at the end of this presentation. So I'll get right into it. First, to really frame things, after extensive modeling, we estimated that there are about 2.3 million undocumented immigrants in the state of California. So that's 1 in every 5 immigrants in the state, nearly 8% of the state's total workforce. And something I really want to drive home with this slide is that this is not a transient population, right? It's a deeply rooted part of California's economy and California's communities. 2/3 of the undocumented population have lived here for more than a decade. Nearly half have lived here for more than 2 decades. And a big reason this population remains undocumented is because we've not passed any comprehensive immigration reform since the 1980s. So a lot of these folks have been left without sort of new legal pathways to citizenship. So we do a lot of different breakdowns by industry and by occupation in the study. One thing we found, though, is that undocumented workers are especially concentrated in these essential roles that really keep our economy afloat. Things like construction, food service, agriculture, caregiving, these are all roles that are already very hard to replace. Like I said, many of these folks have lived here for a long time. They've been in their jobs for many, many years, sometimes decades, with longstanding institutional knowledge of their jobs. And these are jobs and industries that are also already facing severe labor shortages, right? These things have been exacerbated by longstanding declines in domestic interest in these jobs, an aging domestic population, among other factors. So when you lose this workforce, we're not harvesting crops, we're not, building homes. We are, prices really end up skyrocketing for everyone, and not just California, but the rest of the nation that relies on a lot of the goods produced in California. So sort of the big key finding that we found is we modeled the entire undocumented labor force and found that California could lose up to $278 billion of its GDP. So that's up to 9% of the state's total GDP when you factor in all these other ripple effects across the economy. And most of what we've seen thus far in a lot of the immigration enforcement that's been playing out in the state has really been related to loss of labor. But even beyond the loss of labor, when you permanently remove a population embedded in the economy, it actually ends up affecting nearly every sector, even sectors that might not have a lot of undocumented workers. So in this case, you'll see sort of three scenarios modeled. One is the real GDP of the state. One is without that direct contribution, those direct wages from undocumented workers. The next one includes things like supply chain impacts. So these are suppliers who, would lose business if an undocumented worker had to shut down their business because they were deported, and they're no longer buying supplies from those suppliers. So, even if those suppliers are fully documented workers, right? So now they're affected, and that ripples down into the supply chain. And finally, that last red line includes losses to consumer spending and household spending in the local economy. If you're deported, you're not going out and patronizing local businesses. You're not spending in the local economy, and that has impacts as well. So the final slide before I pass the baton to my co-author, Maria-Elena, we found that undocumented immigrants in California actually pay a lot of taxes. Even when we account for lower compliance rates and remittances back to home countries, undocumented workers in the state pay up to $23 billion a year in taxes, over half of which is paid to the federal government, right? Despite the fact that in many cases, these workers are unable to access the federal service that they themselves are helping fund. And it's not just income taxes, right? It's like everybody else. They're paying, sales and excise taxes on everyday goods. Property taxes. We found that a third of undocumented immigrants own their own home in the state. Again, have been here for a very long time. A lot of them have deep ties to their communities, among other contributions. And California is already a donor state. We send more to the federal government than we get back. So when we deport our undocumented population, it's not just California that suffers. It's really a ripple effects that we would see across the national economy. So I'll let Maria-Elena take it from here.
Great, thank you.
Oh,
I'm on mute.
I'm so sorry. I meant to mute myself.
Okay, you can hear me now. So in addition to conducting economic analysis, we conducted in-depth interviews with 39 stakeholders across the state, business leaders, elected officials, and representatives from community-based organizations. And these stakeholders confirmed for us what we see in the data, that undocumented individuals are deeply rooted in California's community and economy, and increased enforcement actions would have ripple effects across the state. So one respondent shared with us, if mass deportations start, there's going to be raids on construction sites. You're not going to have homes being built. Pretty simple. Early on in January, there was some increased enforcement in Kern County. And so our interviews were able to capture sort of what that impact looked like. And one respondent here shared just what had transpired over just a few days in one location in California. On Wednesday, growers reported no-shows. Individual companies said they've got a quarter of their workforce that didn't show up for work. The economic impact was probably in the small millions. You can change the slide. What these voices really shared with us overall is that the initial impacts of mass deportations in California may initially be unevenly felt across sectors and regions. So we may see certain industries such as agriculture or construction, or certain communities such as Southern California having initially greater enforcement activity. But ultimately, the economic costs will be felt across the entire state. So one elected official really shared for us and illustrates what those ripple effects could look like. Our city would be hard hit because the general fund is funded by people spending, from people having businesses and paying taxes. There are a lot of business owners that are immigrants. So what would happen is that there would be jobs left empty, buildings and businesses would shut down. Our downtown would be kind of a ghost town. Ultimately, in our stakeholder interviews, numerous individuals expressed the need for collaboration and coordinated efforts to stop mass deportations. So as we transition to our panel, I'll leave you with this one quote that I think really captured the essence of how people felt we should react as a state to push back on mass deportations. The workers themselves don't have much of a voice. So we need the restaurant industry, the hotel industry, and agriculture. It's going to take a lot of voices expressing a lot of concern and recommending to our Congress and senators that this is impacting the lives of people and businesses and needs to be addressed. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Abby, for the panel.
Thank you so much, Maria-Elena. And here you can see, if you want to scan this QR code for the full report, if you like charts and graphs and you like, really in-depth data on this topic, there's a lot more in here that we didn't cover. So please feel free to do that or follow up with either of us if you have specific questions after the webinar. So I'll stop sharing. And next, I'm really thrilled to be joined by three really incredible panelists who bring, a range of expertise and perspectives to the table. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of them, and then I'll begin with some questions to sort of frame the discussion, and we'll leave some time at the end for audience Q&A. So first, I'd like to introduce Tran, who is the Executive Director of the Services, Immigrant Rights, and Education Network, also known as SIREN, and also a partner at Justice at Work Law Group. Welcome, Hui. Next, we have George Carrillo, CEO and co-founder of the Hispanic Construction Council. Thank you for being here, George. And finally, we have Bryan Little, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at the California Farm Bureau. Thank you all so much for being here. So, Hui, I'd like to just start with you to sort of frame the discussion, give us some context around sort of what's been politically proposed and what's actually legally possible. Can you help sort of clarify what the legal limits around mass deportation, what they are, and given the recent sort of enforcement actions unfolding in Los Angeles, the high-profile raids, increased sort of federal activity, what does that signal for the Bay Area?
Yeah, definitely can cover that. And thank you, Abby, for the invitation to speak with all of you all today. As mentioned, my name is Hui Tran. I'm Executive Director at SIREN. And I think, when we ask about what the potential limits are of mass deportation, the reality is that right now, it's really hard to answer that question. Everything that we have seen this federal administration try, it shocks the mind to a lot of folks who've been doing this work for a while. And even for those who don't, we are seeing the kind of tactics used and applied in a way that has led many folks to question what is the extent of the authority and the power of the federal government to enact this inhumane and xenophobic policy. Let me give you just an example of what we're seeing out of LA, and that is actually a great reference point. And some context before we get into LA, the biggest question mark has been, what exactly should we expect to see, right? There's been a lot of tactics that happened across the country, starting in places like Tennessee, Texas, Florida, where the enforcement actions are incredibly aggressive. And then we'll see those tactics trickle over. But for the most part, the Bay actually hasn't seen those super heavy-handed tactics yet. We cannot act, though, as if these aren't going to come our way. California is the largest prize, if we look at it from the administration's perspective, of immigrants, communities, right? We have the largest immigrant population in the entire country. We have the strongest protections across the country. And so when we look at what the absolute worst case scenario can be right now, that is LA. What we're seeing in LA is ICE making a public declaration that it was going to sit in and occupy the city for 60 days. And that started last month. They are getting support from the National Guard and Marines to protect their agents who technically, these soldiers are not supporting the operations and they are just there to protect the agents themselves. But what we're seeing on the ground is agents now indiscriminately roaming through the streets of LA and neighboring communities to detain people. Recently, there was a lawsuit against these wide-ranging tactics in the district court, where a judge ruled that the indiscriminate tactics of ICE agents in LA and the surrounding communities to simply go out and detain anyone, and based on what they do, where they're hanging out, and how they look, is actually discriminatory. Now, that ruling itself is not going to stop these agents from doing what they're going to do. In fact, this administration has shown that they are going to challenge and appeal those decisions so that they can continue to go out and just arrest people without any kind of probable cause, without any evidence of wrongdoing or harm. That is the absolute worst. We are talking about roving bands of quote unquote law enforcement agents who are going around and detaining people for no reason at all, except for how they look, perhaps the language they oversee them taking, or if they're hanging out at a Home Depot parking lot. Now, right now, ICE does not have the resources to run this kind of operations across the country. They don't. In total, ICE is about 8,500 agents, I believe, and that's to cover the entire country. With the amount of resources they're putting in LA, it's one of those moments where we can look at that and say, you know what, will that happen anywhere else? Probably not. But that doesn't mean they're not going to move around. And once the federal budget actually comes into play, we are going to start seeing more draconian enforcement actions. Even from the small actions that we have actually seen out here in the Bay Area, there have already been economic impacts. The first operation that happened in San Jose was back in January, and it was a targeted operation. ICE set up its staging area in a very well-known Target in East Side San Jose to go after a person that they had on their list, right? A person with removal orders, a person who was targeted. The mere presence of those agents and the knowledge of this operation caused a 20% drop in foot traffic for East Side businesses. The services and nonprofits that operate out of East Side San Jose saw a 20% drop in attendance, and East Side San Jose has not yet recovered. In fact, I've heard some recent estimates that it actually has gotten worse, where attendance and foot traffic for businesses and agencies in East Side has actually gone down 30% since January. So this is not the worst of what we're seeing. We need to prepare for what else can happen.
Thank you so much, Hui. And that is extremely powerful stuff. I think very in line with what we were hearing in a lot of the interviews that we conducted about sort of absenteeism. And, there's the actual mass deportation and the economic impact from that. But there's also the economic impact just from the fear of a mass deportation occurring or enforcement activity just happening in your neighborhood or in your community. And that alone can have somewhat similar economic impacts, especially when we look at that sort of foot traffic consumer spending piece. We also saw, a study, an analogous study come out around the same time as ours from a Stanford professor who found a 20% drop in school attendance during a lot of the Kern County sort of raids in January of this year. So there's effects on sort of a lot of different types of institutions. We'll definitely get back to you and talk more because I think there's interest in understanding more about the state level protections and maybe to the extent that sanctuary laws are what that can actually offer in terms of protections. But I'd like to move to you next, George, just to hear a little bit about the construction industry. In our report, we found that 26% of construction laborers are undocumented in the state. 61% are immigrants of any status. So just kind of curious to hear what would losing this workforce mean for the sector in California and beyond, and impacts on project timelines or cost to consumers, things like that.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. My name is George Carrillo. I'm the CEO of the Hispanic Construction Council. We're also a big national think tank. And our concern right now within the construction industry is that there's critical infrastructure that we have to address in this country. From hurricane recoveries to levees and dams not being maintained. Look at the tragedy that happened in Texas. Look at the bridges out in Baltimore. Our climate is changing. Our infrastructure is aging. We see the wildfires out in California. We still have to rebuild Los Angeles. So there's so much that needs to be done. There's not the lack of work. There's actually the lack of workforce in order to support everything that we need to do. And just in California alone, if you look at California is about 2.5 million homes behind. We have a large immigrant community. About 41% is the immigrant community in the construction industry. We estimate about 20% of that are undocumented. And so when you're faced with this critical workforce shortage, which about 82% of businesses across the country are saying we don't have enough workers, it's going to be devastating to the economy. It's going to be devastating to the GDP of California, specifically, Sacramento. You have a lot of construction projects right now that are starting this year. Just look at your airport expansion. I think it's about $1.3 billion in expansion. You have UC Davis Medical Center That's over $3 billion. You have the Republic FC Stadium, the 9-town development. You have a lot of big, massive projects. The problem is it's not lack of the opportunity to build and maintain, it's the lack of workforce. Since the Trump administration has been in office since January, we've seen now a slowage of completion of projects. We're now down by 22% on critical infrastructure projects across the country. This is devastating. I constantly am reminding people that all roads lead to construction. If we don't build it, we don't have it. And everything that we build needs to be maintained. If you want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, if you want to have massive data centers here, if you want to continue to maintain roads and bridges and highways and hospitals and stadiums and things of that nature, we need to be able to maintain it. But we need to have that critical labor. And, there's a lot of people that will say, immigrants are stealing jobs, and that's not true. We have an all-time low unemployment rate. In this country, we have not done a good job of teaching our children the trades in K through 12. So we have a struggling pipeline of people entering the trade. Also, on top of that, this is a very aging workforce. Just give you a quick statistic on, because the construction industry is just so vast, but the average roofer right now is about 48 years old. And you're talking about a very dangerous job. A lot of people fall, trip, fatalities within the construction industry. And the average age of a roofer is 48 years old. We just don't have the pipeline. We don't have the youth behind it to be able to support it. We've actually taken a very proactive approach in that and creating a policy called Building America Stronger. And it's a policy proposal that we launched about 4 weeks ago. We believe we have sponsorship in the Senate to get to planning committee. It'll allow people in the construction industry that have been here for at least 5 years to be able to stay with a work visa. We estimate about $50 billion in new revenue over the next 5 years, and we're asking Congress to reinvest that into K through 12, specifically in the construction trades, to bring that education back to our classrooms. So we believe we're headed in the right direction. But again, I just think that people don't really understand the impact of these decisions that the administration is making, and understanding that there is a domino effect. If you hurt the construction industry, you also hurt. We are a purchaser of goods like you cannot believe, from light bulbs to carpets to staples to nails, to sheet metal, all these different things. It will dramatically hurt the economy. It'll hurt the GDP. And these are the conversations that I think that we need to really start having, because this is not what's in America's best interest. And just like what recently was being said, there's a method, there's a way that we can enforce immigration. There's no reason why we have to do it in this fashion. For myself, I was a sheriff deputy down in Arizona, and I remember when they started to give us additional duties and as far as immigration. That's not what none of us signed up to do. And we're seeing sort of this repeat in history happening here again. And I really do believe that we need to ask ourselves, what type of country do we want to be? What type of industry? How do we want to promote growth? How do we want to live the American dream? And understanding we are a community of immigrants. This is what our country is. There is no reason now to turn our backs on what makes America great, which is our immigrant population.
Thanks so much, George. And I mean, almost all of those stats you gave are very in line with what we found. And we did a deep dive in the report on construction and on agriculture, which is why it's so great to hear, from you and what you've heard from your constituents and, all of the goods that you discussed. Construction was #1 when we calculated the GDP impact by industry in the state. Construction was by far the biggest sort of loser should we actually undergo a mass deportation policy. 16% of the state's GDP relies on undocumented labor, and that's a conservative estimate. So, this would be, not in California's best interest or really the country's best interest. So we'll definitely get back to you to talk a little bit more about, I think interested to hear about small and mid-sized construction firms. A lot of those are owned by immigrants or owned by undocumented workers, sort of how those, especially led by Hispanic business owners, how that might be affected. But I'd love to move to Bryan just to hear a bit about agriculture and sort of how this would affect the state's very, very lucrative and vast agricultural ecosystem. So similarly, our report found that 33% of California's farm workers are undocumented. Again, that might be a slightly conservative estimate. 75% are immigrants of any status. And in a state that produces, 1/3 of the nation's vegetables, 2/3 of the nation's fruits and nuts, we are at the backbone really of feeding the country, right? How do you see sort of current or proposed immigration enforcement policies impacting farm operations and sort of labor availability, both now and in the near future?
Well, your figure for the percentage of undocumented workers we have in the industry struck me as being a little low. I think it's closer to half. And the net result of that is there's been a lot. So other than in Ventura County, in the wake of what happened in Los Angeles, and a handful of other incidents, I don't really know about any direct on-farm worksite enforcement happening in agriculture, because every time those rumors crop up, I call my contacts all over the state and say, hey, what's happening there? Usually what's happening is some other type of law enforcement activity going on that's reported on social media as a worksite raid on a farm. Rarely pans out. To give you an example of what typically happens, I got a report about 2 weeks ago from Riverside County where there was supposedly worksite enforcement going on in Thermal and Mecca. It turned out that it was the National Guard and DEA suppressing an illegal pot grow in the desert, but it was widely reported as being a worksite enforcement action. The result of that was that people stayed home from work. And that's been happening all over the state because these things crop up all over the state every week or so. Something like this happens. I know of at least one strawberry producer in Ventura and Orange County who's lost most of his crop for the season. I'm sure there are other crop losses that I'm just not aware of that's happening here and there. So it's going to have an impact on our ability to be able to produce food, since we produce such a huge amount of America's food here in California. And in the end, people were terribly upset over the winter and the fall about the price of eggs. Well, it'll be pretty interesting to see what happens when we start getting prices like that on virtually every item in the produce department at the supermarket. I think consumers are not going to be very happy about that. And I think there could be some political repercussions to that. So we'll have to see how this all unfolds. It seems like the current administration can't make up its mind what it wants to do about this. I guess let's see, if it's Tuesday, we must be doing one thing. If it's Thursday, we must be doing something else. That's caused a lot of stress for our workforce, a lot of stress for agricultural producers who don't know if there's anybody that's involved in business, and I'm sure George can tell you this too. Anybody who operates a business will tell you that the worst thing you can do to them is create uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen in the future, not having stability, not knowing what tax policy is going to be, not knowing what employment policy is going to be or immigration policy, and not knowing how to plan accordingly for that. And that's the position that a lot of our producers are in right now. So, we're not in our peak production seasons yet. We're about 3 weeks away from that. When we get there, we'll be employing about 480,000 people every day doing agriculture in California. As you noted, we grow everything in California from avocados to zucchini and grow more than just about anybody else. We're a $56 billion industry. And this continues like this. I'm really concerned that it's going to have an impact in terms of growing, harvesting, and handling the processing of a lot of the stuff that we produce in California and ship to the rest of the country.
And we heard a lot of the same things, and especially related to sort of how reliant we are on sort of manual harvesting in California because our crops are so specialized compared to something like corn in the Midwest. So mechanization is really not something that we can scale up or rely on. The H-2A visa program is also not totally scalable. Could you talk a little bit about, why we are so reliant on this sort of labor force, and sort of maybe also what you mentioned possible increases in consumer prices, like how likely is that? I know you can't predict the future, but just based on what you're seeing now, like what do you think people can kind of expect?
Well, when it comes to trying to scale up, right, your options are either you either mechanize it or automate it. That has been happening a lot, and that has had an impact on the mix of crops that we grow in California. California became the largest producer, maybe in the world, of almonds a few years ago. because our climate is perfect for it. And we had machinery that made almond harvesting relatively easy to do. We had almonds grown in California all along, but the way it was harvested was with a crew of people walking through the orchard with long sticks and bags, knocking the almonds off the trees and picking them up off the ground. Now with shakers and sweepers, it's a much, much more efficient operation. And then you combine that with our climate and our ability to grow almonds beginning in February and almost through the summer. And that starts to really, sorry, I just forgot to mute my phone. That starts to have the effect of being able to make it very, very efficient to produce commodities like that. So, but a lot of commodities don't lend themselves to that. So I can't imagine any way to mechanize harvest of avocados in San Diego County on a hill with a 40% slope. And you're using orchard ladders to harvest that, or strawberries. If you've ever grown strawberries in your backyard and picked strawberries, try to imagine mechanizing that task with acres and acres of strawberries and dozens of people picking that. So that is not something that's going to happen in the immediate future. You mentioned the H-2A program. Like I said, we have about 480,000 people working every day. If half of those people are not legally documented, I want to clarify, everybody has documents. It isn't a question of farmers hiring undocumented workers, but everybody has documents. Everybody does I-9s. It's just that their documents are going to turn out perhaps to not be of legitimate provenance. If we have to replace half of the 480,000 people we have working every day, that's going to almost double the size of the H-2A program. When I was working in Washington, one of the jobs I did was doing congressional liaison around the Labor Department's activities around work-based visa programs. And I can assure you that if the H-2A program has to suddenly grow by 250,000 people overnight, it will break. It cannot handle that kind of throughput. So we will have a crisis of just simply not being able to have enough people do what we need to do. We find ourselves suddenly reliant on the H-2A program. And some of the things we've heard coming out of Washington are these ideas like, well, have people go back to where they came from. My screen is flashing on and off. I'm not sure what's going on your end. You guys hearing me okay?
Yep, you look
Okay,
and sound fine to me.
Okay, good. Because mine was looking really strange there for a couple minutes.
Oh no.
So anyway, if we try to push everybody through the H-2A program, that's going to be a disaster. It's just not going to work. And when I think it just all goes back to when I started, I cut my policy teeth in this area. I was working at American Farm Bureau in Washington, D.C. in 1995 for about 8 years. And they told me when I started that job, the most important thing I would do was fix the ag immigration problem. Here we are 30 years later, and I don't know if that's a testament to how hard the problem is or how bad I was at my job. I'm not really sure. But the politics of it are really, really tough. And I'm not optimistic that there's going to be a solution in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, and let's maybe talk about sort of solutions and sort of, this is a question I'd like to pose to everybody. Sort of what do you think is needed most right now to actually address, these current enforcement actions in the state? What role can the business community actually play in protecting, the state's economy and these workers under these proposals and policies? Maybe Hui, I'd love to start with you, just to also talk about maybe what you've been hearing from your clients and constituents about, some of these concerns.
The work that we do, right, was directly with impacted families. Like, we get to hear kind of like their biggest concerns and fears, and we also get to celebrate their wins with them. One of the issues that was recently highlighted from some of our clients in the San Jose Spotlight was the fact that we actually have clients who hear about everything that's going on and they just decide it's time to walk away, right? So they will self-deport. We have clients who ask us this, and excuse me, not even clients, but our community members. When we first found out election results in November, they had a frank conversation with us about whether they should stay. And these are families that have been in the States for decades. And these families were hardworking, no criminal record. The parents did every job they could do to provide a future for their kids. So these are the kind of conversations that actually occur on a regular basis. Right? One of the things that we've really got to highlight here, and I'm kind of jumping quickly into a call to action because I think is really important to highlight, right, is we have to fight this crime narrative. The crime narrative is what justified all of these horrific policies in the first place. The crime narrative was what got our population to buy in and say, maybe we do need a little bit of harshness, right? And what we got in return is a lot of harshness. In one of the things that every time we're asked to see if we can bring out a community member to speak, right? One is we have to work with the community members to overcome their fear. And then when we can get them to overcome their fear, we give them the room to create their own comments about what it is that they want the broader community to understand, right? And that is the number one thing that gets brought up over and over and over to counter, right? The crime narrative is demonstrably false. Right? So we know right now for a fact, 75% of the people who are detained have no serious criminal convictions at all, right? 50%, right? So that 75% is broken down. 50% actually have nothing, not even a speeding ticket to their name. The other 25%, again, nothing more than traffic violations. So it is this narrative that is justifying all of these ridiculous policies that we have to deal with now. And that is actually one of the things that I think we have to be able to fund and support, right? Just how do we counteract this narrative that somehow the immigrant population is responsible for all of the crimes, right? One other thing I just want to highlight for this, right? How the crime narrative itself is just demonstrably false. Before the federal government started taking down these reports, the FBI itself published reports confirming that native-born citizens are actually more than twice as likely to commit crimes, to violate the law, than folks who are immigrants into the United States, right? So I think that's one of the big areas that we really got to hit on. There is this kind of mindset around the immigration issue that has to be challenged and hit head on that crime piece. And on the other side of it too, in terms of just what we continue to hear on the ground, right, from the organizations themselves, from the agencies that are doing this work, we actually have to deal with this fear too amongst our colleagues, right? The biggest fear we face right now is what happens, or what do we do when the federal government starts targeting us, right? I'm sure that many of you have heard about this letter sent from a congressional committee called the Committee on Homeland Security. There are nonprofit organizations in our network, in our universe here, that have received that letter, and that instantly caused the organizations to take a step back and think, what do we have to deal with right now? So even aside from just the community members themselves, the people doing the work, the people who are trying to step in to protect and serve these communities as best as we can, we're being threatened directly, right, by the government. There was actually just a hearing held today in DC where the folks from the Committee on Homeland Security were trying to paint the narrative that our immigration crisis was an inside job, and all of the NGOs who support immigrant communities are part of this inside job. So that's gone on our end. Those are the two biggest concerns and risks or the biggest challenges we feel like we have to face. One is we still have to fight this crime narrative. Every single opportunity that comes up, or every time we hear it, we have to push back on it, because that's been the justification for all of this in the first place. But then two, even for the organizations that are doing the work, we are now coming directly under threat. And that's going to be putting a big chill too on our ability to stand up, to fight, and to protect the people who need it right now.
And we'll go to you next, George, in a second, because I saw your hand raised, but maybe just could you briefly touch, because thinking about sort of a lot of these are actions coming from the federal government, and the solutions often lie in DC, right? But could you maybe talk about some of the state level protections, things like SB 54, California sanctuary law, other maybe employment related safeguards, anything that could sort of meaningfully limit these federal enforcement efforts? I think a lot of businesses, when we were conducting our interviews, it's not just immigrant advocacy groups, it's like businesses were like, we need know your rights trainings. We need to understand what we're supposed to do when ICE or some other, agency shows up at our door. So, could you maybe talk about how much legal weight those protections actually carry when these federal priorities, shift? And use the word draconian, like we might actually see a lot more of that happening, especially in the Bay Area, that maybe we haven't seen yet. To what extent can we sort of safeguard that with some of our existing state level protections?
Well, I will actually tell you that SB 54 has been one of the most effective protective statutes that have been in place across the country. Right, there's a reason why California wasn't an immediate target of this administration. There was that one operation that happened in Bakersfield under Border Patrol, and that actually preceded the inauguration of current president. Right, and outside of LA too. Right, like there was a lot of things happening across the country that just wasn't happening here for months. And honestly, the biggest reason for that is because we put into the place the strongest restrictions on any kind of local cooperation with the federal government. I mentioned before, ICE has this big limitation of resources, right? They just don't have enough people to go after the big prize, right? That is California. Now, that is going to change, but they're going to have to do it entirely on their own, right? They're going to have to do it entirely with their own agents. The biggest thing that we can continue to do is really clarify exactly what role local law enforcement has in doing anything related to immigration enforcement. We've actually met with a lot of with our law enforcement chiefs in Santa Clara County, and then and from the cities to the county, we often have conversations around, look, when LA comes here, because for us it's not a question of if but when. When LA comes here, when what we see happening in LA come to our area, right? What role does local law enforcement play? And what we keep getting told is our job is just to protect life and property. Our job is just to protect life and property. But what does that actually mean when the rubber hits the road, when we've got masked federal agents who carry no identification and feel no need to actually identify themselves as law enforcement, roaming the streets and plucking people off of corners? Right. That's part of the reason why one of the things we can do is to expand on it, is to support the law, support the bill that would prohibit law enforcement officers from wearing masks in the performance of their duties. Right. That is one of the things that we got to do, because I mean, one of the anecdotes coming out of LA is you've got roving bands of zealots who at this point love what's going on, and so they just round up their buddies and they're going to go around and try to pick up people off the streets. Yeah. Right. It is a terrifying thing to think of, that people who are armed, wearing bulletproof vests, and wearing tactical gear can walk around and just throw people into a van. Right. Now, for our businesses, the Fourth Amendment applies to our businesses. Right. We've actually, at SIREN, we've actually already done trainings with local unions, with local businesses, about how the Fourth Amendment applies in your workplace. Some of the things that our businesses can do is to make sure that the workplace itself is a safe environment for their employees and their staff. And that means creating safety plans. That means going over protocols for what happens when ICE shows up. And that means rearranging or resetting your practices to create those safe places in the business, where folks know that if they are there, law enforcement cannot enter that space without a warrant. Right. We can offer that up, and Abby can share our contact information out for you all here. But those trainings we think are vital for our businesses, those who want to create the kind of environment where their staff feel comfortable.
Great. Yeah. And there's a couple questions related to some of the things you touched on, which we can get to momentarily when we open up to audience Q&A. But George, I know you had your hand raised and maybe you wanted to speak on some of the things that he was talking about, or just kind of what the role you think the business community could play to, protect some of these issues.
Yes, thank you. This reminds me of a situation where there's a bully, which is the federal government, picking on, a smaller kid on the playground. And what's interesting with this situation that we see is that, the bully has all the power in the world, right? They control the Senate, they control the courts to a certain degree. They're able to win elections based off of rhetoric. And I agree with you 100%. We have to correct that language, because as Americans, we break the law every single day. I guarantee it. As a former sheriff deputy and police officer, I know that we all commit a crime every single day. We're not perfect drivers. We commit traffic violations all the time, which are civil violations. And crossing the border is a civil violation. It does not automatically mean that you are a criminal. We've allowed people to win an election based off of lies, based off of deception. And our silence is complacency. Our silence is what what we're faced with. These are the consequences of an election. And, you know, for someone like me, like I've been a public servant my whole career. Outside of that, you know, actually my day job outside of outside of running this organization is I'm an executive in government. During COVID, I ran the Department of Social Determinants of Health for my state. And I will tell you that there's, when you look at social determinants of health, you have to understand there is a domino effect on society. And we have to understand the consequences of this rhetoric and how it hits our society and how these, each pillar continues to fall. And we will all suffer from these actions. What I have to say is that what we can do is it's time to stand up. It's time not to be afraid. Understand that our immigrant community, they can't stand up and protest. They can't, you know, call their local senator or congressman or reach out to the president. That's just not going to happen. They have no avenue of being able to fight this. We as Americans need to stand up. We need to be able to put our money where our mouth is, because these types of actions, just like for what we're doing, how we're trying to push forward the policy proposal, it takes money, it takes effort, right? There has to be intentionality. Business owners need to join and figure out which groups that they want to support. They need to collaborate with other groups and themselves within the business organization and show the president. The president admires strength. And so I'll give you a brief example. When it came to tariffs and it was affecting the auto industry, guess what? The big three called the president and said, you need to stop this. And he did, and he backed off of his tariffs. It's the same thing here. But for some reason, we feel like we can't stand up. I don't know how many business owners I've talked to that say, George, I don't agree, but I'm just too scared to say anything. And I'm like, you're worth billions of dollars. What is there to be scared of? Our immigrant population, our undocumented immigrant population didn't just get here yesterday. This has been a problem for decades. We have struggled with resolving this, and we have allowed politicians to either win or lose an election based off of our immigrant population. And now when we're faced with these very difficult situations, we fail to stand up and to say, this is not who we want to be. And so I think that as a community, we have to stand up. We have to petition. We have to do it in the right way. But we have to be able to do that in a coordinated fashion to show the president, if you do this, there will be economic consequences.
Sure.
And that's not something that he wants affected right now.
That is entirely true. And I'm curious to hear from Bryan how that, you know, sort of role of the agricultural business community, you know, what role they play in sort of rolling back some of these narratives of, you know, the immigrants as criminals, or, you know, and what elements of, we got a question about the elements of California's food supply chain are most sort of vulnerable to disruption. Two sort of different questions, but trying to mix in some of these audience Q&A because we're starting to get some of those rolling.
Well, we've been talking for years about the fact that our workforce, our people have been here in many cases for decades. Their spouses are green card holders, citizens in many cases. They have children who are U.S. citizen children. They are settled in their communities. They rent homes, own homes, and they pay taxes just like all the rest of us do. So, you know, that's been a part of our advocacy from the beginning. And if you go and look at our communications that our news releases on our website, you'll see that we talk about that every opportunity we get to talk about how our population, our people who work and grow your food are not criminals. And that's been also part of our advocacy around having a common sense solution or resolution to some of these problems and addressing it in a way that makes sense. Let me tell you what does not make sense, and that's the idea. So all the conversation is around amnesty. We jokingly call it the A word. And you know that conversation around amnesty goes nowhere because nobody's talking about amnesty. We're talking about giving people an opportunity to earn, having largely already earned it for the most part, the ability to be able to continue to live and work in the United States, continue to support production of food, and continue to ensure that you're going to have groceries in the grocery store when you go there to get groceries for your family. The idea of one thing that's floated years ago is the idea of a touchback, right? That you can go back to someplace when you've been here for 30 years, there's no place for you to go back to. It's an absurd idea. And we've made a point of making sure that people understand as much as we can, as they're willing to listen to us, that it is an absurd idea. The idea that you can't amnesty someone who came here using the only avenue they had available to them, that was available to them at the time that they came, and we need them to be here to be able to grow our food. It is, again, it's an absurd conversation that we keep having over and over again. But there are times that I wonder if either party really wants to fix this problem, or if they'd really like to have the problem as a stick to beat the other party with. And we've got to figure out how to overcome that impasse in order to get to a solution that actually makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, if anyone else wants to speak on that, I mean, thinking about sort of the solutions-oriented mindset of this, like how do we sort of counter this false narrative? I mean, we have all established that there is a false narrative, right? Like Hui, those stats you brought up are really, really impactful and powerful, that most of these folks have zero criminal convictions. I mean, pretending like the native-born community doesn't is, just not an effective way of thinking about this at all. So, how do we actually do that effectively? And then how do we actually reach a real solution, both, statewide and federally?
Yeah.
And anyone could really kind of speak to this.
I'll try to chime in and make it quick, just because I do this, I think can help answer the question for Sandra as well, right? Let me just start off on an individual point, right? Because I think just the reality is this. I spoke to a group of Asian American activists recently, right? And what I told them flat out was, we've got to have hard conversations with the people we care about the most. Everybody knows folks in our family who are buying into this, right? I don't think there's I don't think we're like unique in that way, right? For some reason, that narrative has taken hold. And we have to be able to counter it at that micro level, because that's how it grew in the first place. A lot of this information spread through social media. It's spread into these particular communication channels that just aren't monitored regularly, right? I know for my family, they got a lot of the information just off of YouTube videos, right? They got all the information from being in like Facebook chat groups or WhatsApp messenger groups where people are just sharing conspiracy theories and nonsense left and right. And unfortunately, we discovered that in 2016, and then we kind of forgot about it in 2020, and it just kind of took hold again, right? So I think on a micro level, we've all got to be prepared to have hard conversations with the people we know and just be upfront about it. We can't be afraid of those conversations. It can be frustrating. It can be hard. I had a conversation with my sister, my mother, my father to try to pull them back from the precipice. I had a long conversation with cousins, right? And after a while, they'll get it, or at least they'll tell me to get it, and then we'll figure it out later on if that's true or not, right? But that's the reality, right? We have to do it on a micro level. On a broader scale, I think there are going to be campaigns coming out where we're going to highlight people and the voices from the community to explain like what is happening right now is not to the quote unquote criminals or the bad guys, right? And just to be clear, I don't think we should create some kind of these exceptions around like, hey, you know what? All this is fine as long as it's bad guys, right? Because to be clear, if the conversation right now was around somebody did something wrong and we're going to hold them accountable, whole different conversation. What's happening right now is we're going to detain and round up a whole bunch of people and then figure out what they did wrong, right? That's the problem right now. So it's the micro conversations. And then for our community here, if there are business associations, I'm not connected to them. We're not necessarily connected to them. But if there are business associations, like push those business associations, push your chambers to put out your messaging and do a campaign around like, hey, what's happening now is wrong, right? If you are part of professional industry, I mean, I'm glad to be on a panel with George and Bryan, right, who are representing two huge industries where immigration plays such a significant role. Let's hear the industries put out that message and say, this is wrong, and push back, right? But yeah, so start micro, but where you all related, where y'all connected, where y'all dug in, push it and make it happen.
Bryan, did you want to add to that a bit? See your hand raised.
There are, I guess, maybe retract what I said before about having little sense of optimism that we can actually accomplish anything here, because there are people out there like the Problem Solvers Caucus in our state legislature in Sacramento, bipartisan, bicameral group of legislators who are interested in finding common ground between the two parties and between everybody that's involved in this conversation. and trying to have calm and rational conversations about what we might be able to do to push the ball forward. And it isn't just in Sacramento. Problem Solvers Caucus is a national organization, and I spent about an hour on a Teams meeting earlier today with the local Sacramento representative of the Problem Solvers Caucus and the COO of the California Farm Worker Foundation, which is doing a lot of work to provide services in the community for people who work in the agricultural industry and their families and their communities, to partly to deal with this and a whole lot of other things around healthcare and housing and welfare for their children and a whole lot of other things like that. And one of the projects they're working on is developing a farm worker advisory council that we can plug into organizations like the Problem Solvers Caucus and other organizations of legislators, so they can hear voices directly from farm workers about what their concerns are, what they think they need, and what they think they want, and to hear it directly from the people who are affected by it. So I think in the long run, those things, the situation is bad, but it's had the effect of galvanizing people to get them to do things that they might not have otherwise thought to do.
And that's a big part of why we embarked on this research too. I mean, just having actionable data, but also mobilizing, folks in the business community who do have a stake. I mean, like I said, we're all part of the same sort of ecosystem. All these sectors are totally inextricably linked, whether or not we actually believe that or not, they are. So what happens to one will happen to another, and all workforces will sort of be affected by these policies. So I think that's a really essential point to drive home. Georgia, did you want to? I'm mindful of time, so we only have about a minute. But why don't we have you close us out, George, with any final sort of thoughts about some of the things that Hui and Bryan left us with?
Sure. So I really do truly believe that we have to come together as a country. We can't be polarized the way we are right now with this extreme thinking, both on the left and on the right. We have to come to the middle, come with some common sense solutions, and we have to start pushing those solutions. I highly encourage people to get educated about the Dignity Act that just was presented by Congresswoman Salazar, that's being supported by 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans. It's a very comprehensive overhaul of our immigration system. We are presenting, building America stronger. Do your research, support on our website. You can sign a petition to be able to support both of those bills. I encourage you to do that. Participate, call your members of Congress. This is what we have to do in order to be able to unite. But especially what Hugh said, on the micro level, is starting to have these difficult conversations. I believe that as Americans, we all want the same thing. And even as immigrants, we all want the same thing. It's a matter of how do we get there? That's where we disagree. And we have to finally come together and be able to say, we are neighbors, we're family. Our kids play together, we grow old together. It's really time to start putting this to bed. Let's put this to rest. But you got to participate. You've got to show up. You've got to stand up. If you don't like what you're seeing, you have to participate. And it doesn't really matter whether you're on the left or the right or in the middle. You just got to show up.
Well, those are great words to end on. And, I just want to thank you all so much for joining today. Huge thank you to bringing such insight and expertise into, our stats and our data and the conversation that we, have sort of started here at the Bay Area Council. So, what we heard today really underscores just how deeply our undocumented community is sort of embedded in California. If you want to dive deeper into any of the data, we linked our study in the chat. But you can also find the full publication on our website, bayareaeconomy.org. And we'll send out slides and, any other materials that, George, Hui, and Bryan spoke about today during this webinar to all attendees. So thank you so much again for being with us, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.